Hello and welcome to today's webinar on overcoming barriers to volunteer recruitment. We'll just wait a few minutes as people join us. My name is Georgie. I am the Chief Engagement Officer at Fetching Events and Communications, and really excited to be delivering today's there we go. Today's webinar. I hope you have all had a great week and having a great Friday. And once again, you may be watching this online, live, or you may be watching the recording. So either way, really excited to have you here. If you are here online, please don't hesitate to pop in the chat where you're joining us from. And I would like to welcome to today's podcast in Elevating Events in 2025, Tracey O'Neill, who is a volunteer engagement and management specialist and consultant. And I will invite Tracey onto the screen. Hello, Tracey.
Hi, Georgie.
How are you?
I'm really well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. And today's webinar is going to be a little bit different because it's going to be you and I having a bit of a chat and really a conversation around volunteer recruitment, volunteer engagement, volunteer management. And it's a sector that you've been in for 25 years or so. And do you want to just share some of the organisations that you have worked with?
Sure. So I started working with volunteers when I lived in Perth for an organisation supporting young people at risk of suicide and self-harm. I've worked with the Starlight Children's Foundation. I've worked with a couple of really large tertiary health services, smaller disability organisations, and most recently I was working with the Brotherhood of St Lawrence here in Melbourne, Victoria.
So you've worked across a range of organisations, and of course people watching this webinar will be working with volunteers either in an ongoing role or maybe in event-specific role. And I know we go back a long way and actually met at a volunteering conference way back when and have shared lots of stories, learnings, I might say, excuse me, and stories along the way. What I'm keen to start with is because I think we all have, well, some people have quite a set idea of volunteer management, and I think it's come from that sort of silent generation or that silent/builder generation, which I know certainly my dad was part of. He was very community and service focused, you know, was in his Rotary, was president of the school council, president of the Sailing Association, you know, president of the church council. If there was an association, Dad was in it and he was president of it. And so, you know, there's that very kind of traditional volunteering that came out, particularly from the post sort of World War I and World War II movements, where that service to country was very important. But of course, we're in 2025 now. And so I'm keen to know, what are some of the trends that you're seeing in volunteering and how it has evolved?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's really important to kind of make sure we are aware of what we're talking about when we talk about trends, because as you said, there are trends in what we're doing and how we're responding, and I think that there are trends in how volunteers are behaving, and I think that's the bit that's really key to what we talk about, because that can really guide us in terms of how we respond. So I think volunteering has been changing for quite some time. And if I can share a little story, I guess, we often don't necessarily predict where it's going to go. So when I started working in volunteer engagement, I remember being part of a really big study. This was probably just over 20 years ago. And the study was really looking at baby boomers and this generation who was set to retire en masse, highly skilled people who were suddenly going to have a whole lot of time on their hands. And I remember there was this huge emphasis at the time on how, as a sector, we prepare for this mass influx of really highly skilled volunteers who would have different expectations to, as you say, that kind of that generation before, who just felt the obligation to contribute to community. What we found over time when the baby boomers came to retirement age was that they actually didn't have the time that we expected. You know, there became what we now know is the sandwich generation, and that kind of generation has expanded younger than just the baby boomers. But when they retired, they found that they had to become responsible for caring for aging parents, as well as very often caring for grandchildren, as well as families had to move into kind of two-parent working household. And so, I think it's really important to kind of look at what's potentially happening, but what's most important for us is what is happening now. So as I said at the start, volunteering has been changing quite slowly. We wouldn't necessarily notice it, but I think there's been a really kind of rapid change. It's only accelerated. It hasn't changed things. It's accelerated those differences. So what we're seeing now really is a continuation of the activities that people came to undertake during COVID. So during COVID, many of our programs, many of our events stopped. Volunteering stopped in many organisations. It was the volunteers who had to stop first. It was seen as higher risk. Many organisations had older volunteers, which was seen as a risk as having them out in the community, wanting to protect their health and their well-being. As well as that of the community. But what we found is that people identified other ways they could contribute in their community. And often it was really community or neighbourhood kind of support. So I know for myself personally, during COVID, my family and I drew little activities on the front pavement for all the kids who were going for their little 5K walk. We put teddy bears in our windows. We had a teddy bear hunt in our community. I baked Anzac cookies for the entire street and put my speaker outside for the dawn service when we had the driveway dawn service. So we really became a lot more connected with our community. And what happened was volunteering, as we know it in the sector, became really seamless. It literally became about identifying a need and kind of showing up and doing it. When we started coming back to our events and to our organisations, I think very often what has happened is we've really tried to launch back into the way we were expecting volunteers to behave beforehand. So we really are seeing a really great interest in what we're calling informal volunteering. And by informal volunteering, we mean people just helping out in their community, helping their neighbours. There's no kind of application process. There's no training. There's no safeguarding and screening. It's literally seeing a need and helping. Really quick recent example, I'm a member of my local reconciliation committee here, and we hosted a barbecue on Sorry Day during National Reconciliation Week. We stuck a notice on social media and we had a couple of people just rock up on the day to help us facilitate the barbecue. I've got the stats in front of me from the very recent volunteering Victoria State of Volunteering report. So this is the data from this is kind of replicated across the country. So this isn't specific to Victoria. But when they surveyed people around Victoria, what they found was that 22% of volunteers, so 22% of people, 22% of volunteers, so people who say they volunteer in formal settings. So they volunteer in organisations or events where they apply and they go through a process and they're selected and they're trained. 47.5%, so nearly half of people who identify as volunteering said that they only volunteer in informal settings. So they're kind of dipping in and out of helping in their community. And 30.4%, so almost a third of volunteers are doing a bit of both, so a bit of formal and a bit of informal. What we also know is that informal volunteering is really underreported as well. So we know that people don't necessarily consider what they do as volunteering, they're just helping out. We know in many cultures that there's not even a word in some languages for volunteering, because it is literally about a part of our culture is we give back. Or if you look at First Nations communities, part of their culture is to literally care for each other. We have extended families, and if we have something, we share it with everybody in our community. And so, that kind of extrapolates out to things like transport or taking time off work to take someone to appointment or whatever it might be. So in terms of volunteering, the expectations of volunteers now are that things are flexible. So they fit in with their
Yes.
lives,
Yep.
that there's opportunities to dip in and out, that you don't kind of sign people up for rosters and say, well, you have to attend every Tuesday at 9 a.m. till 2 p.m. That people get the chance. Think about things like Parkrun. We know it's on 8 o'clock every Saturday, but you don't have to go every Saturday. There's a whole team of people, and you literally just have to sign up when you have the availability to go.
Absolutely.
So,
And I was just going to touch on, because you talked about the work you've done with your local reconciliation group. And it was very remiss of me to not do an acknowledgement of country to start off this, because I'm actually, spoiler alert, not in Australia at the moment. But I would love you to tell me which country you're joining us from, and maybe you'd like to lead the acknowledgement of country.
very happy to lead the acknowledgement of country, Georgie. Thank you. And it is remiss of both of us. So I am coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I would like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people, the traditional custodians of this beautiful land that I live, work and play on. Pay my respects to elders past and present, and any First Nations people who are watching with us today. I think for me, Georgie, one of the really deep, continuing, beautiful parts of First Nations culture is their storytelling. Which is what we always do when we catch up. It's about sharing stories. And so I would like to really acknowledge that they have this deep history of storytelling and how important that is for all of us in learning and connection and growing. And so, pay my respects to all First Nations people today.
Thank you. And as you say, COVID brought around opportunities to get involved in ways that people hadn't been in the past. And I think while obviously we, didn't want to be interrupted by a pandemic, it did speed up trends that were already happening. And what I have feared and what I do see is that people have just bounced back to the pre-COVID settings and not actually learn all those things that have evolved. And volunteer management, is one of those things. I really pick up your point around people dipping in and out, because I think there used to be that expectation, well, if they can't volunteer 1 day a week, then we can't have them. And I think there's often that perception of, well, if they can't fit in with us, it's too much work. And while it is going to create more work in some instances, it's actually going to aid you in others. And I did some work about 10 years ago with a sporting organisation that were trying to look at their volunteers, and we actually realised they had 3 streams of volunteers. So they had volunteers that were board members, they had volunteers that were officials, so judges, stewards, that kind of thing, and then they had event volunteers. And depending on the stream that you fitted in, depended on the kind of training that you needed, the kind of commitment that you needed, whether you needed to be in person or whether you could do it remotely. Because what they were trying to do was address all volunteers with this broad brushstroke, when in fact someone who comes once a year to volunteer at an event does not need to go through everything that a board member needs to go through. And once we broke it down, it was really easy to see kind of how where people could dip in, and it helped volunteers work out, okay, where do I fit in? Which volunteer stream works for me?
And I think we can think even more broadly than that, because often I think one of the traps that we can fall into is viewing volunteers and volunteering as, a way to get things done. So it's about the task, and I guess one of my mottos is that volunteers aren't here to help us do more with less.
Yes.
Volunteering is a really powerful community engagement strategy. And if all we're doing is thinking about what are the things that we need to get done, where do we need more hands or more bodies, we really restrict ourselves in terms of how we can engage community in what we do. Because there are ways for us to engage volunteers in the process or in the innovation or in the program development. So there's a lot of ways that we can involve people. So if I look at some of the work that I've done, we have engaged volunteers in things like reviewing processes. So we engaged
Yes.
some local community members who were had a refugee experience. English was their second language. They were very recent, refugees here in Australia, and so they didn't have proficient English. So when we were developing processes, so for example, applying for a police check, we developed some information sheets and instructions. These beautiful community members were actually able to go through the process and provide us feedback on how easy they were to understand, how inclusive they were. And that's the only kind of contribution that they needed to make, and that's what they wanted to do. They felt like they were contributing. They didn't need to do it on a particular day. They didn't need to go through the safeguarding. All they were doing was providing us with with some feedback. Another really great idea that I often encourage organisations to do, because I'm very passionate about inclusion and accessibility, things like, having people caption your social media videos for accessibility. Just sending them the next week's worth of photos and asking them to write a photo description for you for people who are vision impaired. There's lots of little things that we can do.
Yes.
People who have experience in training who might want to come in and review your training packages or help facilitate your training.
Yes.
There's lots of ways we can think of, if we get past that idea that volunteers are just here to help us do the stuff.
Absolutely. And I mean, if I think of an event setting, they're our eyes and ears. They are out on the ground. So I know in events, they are the ones that can come back to us and say, this isn't working. This isn't working. We're getting feedback on this. And we can actually adapt and tweak the event in real time because of that information that they're bringing back. And they're fresh eyes, as you say.
Yes.
I think co-design is so important to bring volunteers into. And I remember being at a volunteering conference, and I think it might have been one that you were at, where they had a panel on how to get young people involved in volunteering.
I was definitely there.
And I can remember Twitter was very active because... I was
one of the tweeters, Georgie. I was definitely one of the tweeters.
Because there was no young person on the panel talking about how getting young people. And I remember a young person standing up in the audience saying, perhaps you would like to ask a young person how to get young people into volunteering. And that I will never forget that. That was in Adelaide, I believe. It is that co-design. And I remember we were on a podcast. We were on a webinar together during COVID, and we had Tim, the CEO of Lord Somers Powerhouse, and talking about how during COVID they had to move their camps online. That organisation has lots of camps, and that's what they're sort of known for. But obviously they couldn't run them, so they actually brought them online. And the first thing they did was actually bring in the volunteers who work on those camps, who were going to be delivering these activities online, and actually brought them into the design process, because you get far better engagement. But these people, they're your gold, they're your gurus on this because they're in it.
Yes. And often they're the experts, Georgie, as well. The YMCA did the same thing during COVID, and they actually handed over an entire project to volunteers, which was setting up the online events for the YMCA during COVID in Victoria. And not only did those young people create and deliver the programs, but they actually brought with them all of the skills needed to set up a video studio. So they had producers and they had directors and they had sound engineers, and the whole thing was, set up and run by volunteers at the YMCA. And I think, another thing that I like to think of is organisations are limited by their budget and have to make really good decisions about where that money goes. And so they determine particular roles that they're going to pay for, and hopefully there's a whack of that for volunteer management for our not-for-profit and volunteer involving organisations. But when you look at kind of our missions as not-for-profit organisations and our purpose, in events organisation, and really what we're trying to deliver, we want to do so much more than what we pay for. You know,
Yes. Yeah.
we don't have, no organisation in the not-for-profit sector has the capacity to deliver everything that would enable them to see their mission come to fruition. You know, at the Brotherhood of
Yes.
St. Lawrence, it was an Australia free of poverty. There is no
Yes.
way one organisation with 1,400 staff and 1,400 volunteers could deliver on that. So volunteering is really a way for us to bring in expertise from people who want to gain something from the experience, you know, whether that now, you know, we're looking at things like pathways to employment. We're looking at for young people in particular, but most volunteers, it's about living their purpose. You know, so many young people now are purpose driven and are making decisions about jobs and about volunteering and what they're prepared to do with their lives around whether it is aligned with their values and purpose. You know, so we have this opportunity to invite so many people in with expertise that our organisations don't pay for. That will only
Yes.
enrich the experience and enhance the outcomes and impact of what we're doing.
Absolutely. And you know, there's often this, well, I shouldn't say often, but sometimes you hear this commentary around, well, young people don't want to give up their time. Young people aren't going to be interested in volunteering. But we know, and it's not just Generation Z, it's usually every generation when they are younger are very social justice driven.
Yes.
And, you know, it's often university. I mean, we can see that even in the world now, that social justice that comes through at university level. So, as you say, it's tapping into that, and it's looking beyond just the volunteer. And I, you know, we've had conversations. I actually hate the word volunteer. I don't have
So do I.
a solution, because it almost just dumbs down it just generalizes this group of people that come with
really
all
puts
sorts of
people in
skills. A box, yeah.
But not
and
even
we've had
skills. I think, sorry, Georgie, I think not even just skills.
No.
When we label someone as a volunteer, I mean, one of the biggest issues that I have, and I often say or talk about, is that volunteer should be used as a verb, not as a noun. You know, a volunteer is not a person. Volunteering is something that someone does. It is a part of someone's full and rich life. And I think that, again, when we see someone as a volunteer, we often see what we need out of them. And we don't necessarily look at what are their networks like? What are the skills that they bring? What are they going to take into the world from this experience? You know, I remember when I worked at a health service, one of the things we did was offer training in advanced care planning. For volunteers. And I remember a volunteer coming to me and saying, Tracey, thank you so much for delivering that training. For the first time ever, I went home and had a conversation with my teenage boys about what I would want to happen if I became unwell and if I died. And I was able to ask them, what if the same thing happened to you? Now, that is not something that she would have done had she not done this training. And we all have this opportunity to create ripples in the community. And I think, going back to a point you made before about this myth that young people don't volunteer, the State of Volunteering report in Victoria has shown that young people actually now have the highest percentage of volunteers. So almost 70% of young people between 15 and 24 are volunteering. I would like to say, though, you know, I think one of the things we need to think of is, with all that happens now around safeguarding and concerns around litigation and, you know, insurance coverage, all this kind of thing, we are at risk of really excluding a generation from volunteering if we don't think creatively about how to introduce younger people than 15 to volunteering. So, you know, we want people when they get to the age of kind of 14, 15, 16 to be actively seeking volunteering and to embed it in, you know, the kind of meaning of their lives and a part of who they are, and something that, you know I know you did as well, but I started volunteering from a really young age. My parents took us along to opportunities. So I think, you know, when we look at opportunities that exist for us to really enhance volunteering, to grow our numbers, not just for our own organisation, but communities in general. How do we create opportunities that make volunteering seamless for families?
Yes.
How do we introduce children and young people to volunteering? Now, that might not necessarily be just about creating opportunities so people can bring children along. It might be for some of our organisations looking at the education programs that we deliver in the community, and very often the people who deliver those speak about our programs and what we do for the community and the outcomes for the community. And we don't necessarily involve our volunteer engagement professionals in those education sessions, or we don't go to speak to them and say, hey, we really want to tell people about volunteering when we're also telling them about our programs and the impacts for community.
Yes.
How can we share the ways that people can get involved? Because that, I think, is a really big gap for us. If we go back to kind of, I think one of the things we want to talk about today is perceived barriers, which I like to see as opportunities. I think barriers we can see as obstacles to get over, whereas really they're opportunities to open doors.
Absolutely. And often we create the barriers. So I remember I worked on an event in the sporting sector, and historically the volunteers who've worked on that event came from within that sport community. And I could see all this opportunity to bring in other people. And I remember when I first spoke to them and said, I'm going to put ads here and I'm going to reach out to these people, whether it was event management students, it was international students, it was expats, or, retired people, a whole range. And the comment I got was, well, they won't want to be involved if they're not from the sport. They won't know anything and they won't want to be involved. And I said, let's just see. And we had a huge response, and it was fantastic because and it was in the equestrian sector. Not everyone wants to be near a horse. Not everyone finds a horse galloping past them that calming. So, but if you're from that sector, you want to be near a horse. So we actually found we were filling gaps that matched what our volunteers were interested in, and we were bringing new skills. So we didn't need the people on ticketing to know about this particular discipline of equestrian. And they brought with them the skills that we needed in ticketing, and we let them be part of the design and had team leaders. And so it wasn't the volunteers that were putting that barrier in place and had a perception. It was actually the community bringing the volunteers in. So it's removing our sort of prejudice and our barriers and how we actually view our programs.
Definitely. One of the things I think it's important to keep in mind is that, when we talk about trends, we're talking about the past. And we can often get really hooked up in this kind of understanding of the trends, and we have to respond to the trends and we have to understand the trends. And I think an important thing to recognise is that we actually have capacity to set trends. When we know the environment that we're existing within, if you collect all the data, if you're speaking to all the people, you're including your community, we're able to actually change things, modify things, and include people in a way that can shift the needle on some of those trends.
Yes.
That it's. And I think you used a really good word. I use it a lot as well, is passive. We can be really, really passive when we're engaging volunteers. And I get it. Like I did it for years myself. We're very time poor. Our roles are really complex. Often other people in our organisations don't understand how complex. And it becomes a matter of survival. And we end up developing processes and systems that make things easy for us.
Yes.
Which I understand, but it often then is one of those things where we are creating our own barriers.
Yes.
If we can kind of look for opportunities, and we can look for opportunities to involve more people with different experiences and backgrounds, if we can look at new innovative ways to include people, we actually increase capacity, we increase potential outcomes and impacts. And I think it's a win-win-win situation for everybody.
Absolutely. And it's completely rethinking the value that volunteers bring, and there's a real richness in there of their skills, their interpersonal relationships, their backgrounds, their empathy, as you say, their social justice. And we've talked about this before of often in events, I'm in the workforce centre and I'll have someone rush in and go, I need a volunteer. I need a volunteer to help with this. And I always joke, I don't have them sitting in my pocket. They are just not this, for want of a better term, dog's body that just, are sitting around waiting for you to suddenly instruct them to do this and that. There's so much more that they bring, but we restrict ourselves. And it's that education, because we know that. But how, and I want to get onto sort of classic mistakes you've seen shortly, but I know a lot of the work you do is actually around educating the wider organisation around the importance of volunteer engagement and what volunteering means, not the perception and perhaps the stereotype that people have got, because part of the problem is that the volunteer manager knows the power, but it's actually bringing the rest of the organisation on board.
It is. It absolutely is. And I think, as I said before, it's a powerful community engagement strategy. And very often we can isolate volunteering as a program or a service that sits over here quite separate from everything else. And I know many of us have experienced that in terms of where we're located in our organisation and, who manages us and who we get to collaborate with. And, I'm pushy. I think it's really important to kind of get in front of people and talk about it. And when you do start linking volunteer engagement with other areas of the organisation where people work, it opens their eyes and they're really excited about the possibilities. The number of teams that I've spoken to where you're just going to get a little bit of information. Tell me about what you do. Tell me about what some of your biggest challenges are. What are some of your, what would you do if you had no limitation on resources? What is something that you and your team would do? If you can have these conversations with people and then start to talk to them about some ideas for how volunteers can get involved, whether that's corporate groups or whether that's skilled volunteers or whether that's people doing some virtual volunteering at home. I know of an organisation who had so micro volunteering is another one. So, that's between kind of 10 and 30 minutes of volunteering, usually online, requiring little to no training. And an organisation in New South Wales had volunteers doing these tasks where they had an accessible spreadsheet with a list of potential partnership organisations that they wanted to approach, and the volunteers would do research online via social media and their websites to be able to start to ask some of the values-based questions and pull out some of the key information. How many staff do they have? What's their mission statement? So there's opportunities for us to really connect capacity and skills in the community with the work that different teams are doing across the organisation. And the other thing, which I have already touched on that I often talk about, is how no organisation can achieve its mission, its big kind of vision, without engaging the community. It's just impossible. And no not-for-profit organisation starts, I guess, without this dream for how the world could be different if it didn't exist in the way it does right now. And to get to that point, to make that really significant change, we need the community on side. We need to educate them. I mean, if I look at the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence, an organisation hoping to eradicate poverty, that includes a whole lot of education. It includes making sure people understand about how systems are set up in our society that can, perpetuate this kind of poverty cycle for people. And if we look at volunteering, one of the things that I noticed really early at the Brotherhood was when we would ask surveys, we'd ask people who volunteer, why do you volunteer? And I was really struck by a number of responses that said, I really want to help those people in need, like those poor people, I just want to help them. And it made me realise that, one of the key things that I hoped that our organisation could do was to help the community understand how if we don't challenge the systems, if we just accept the systems and go and volunteer to make us feel better, we're actually perpetuating the ongoing harm that we're hoping to reduce.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I think volunteering has this incredible opportunity to be a vehicle for storytelling and a vehicle for social change. And every organisation can kind of tap into that and really look at what are the education points, what are the key things that we can share with people in our community. Because volunteers, if you get them on board and you give them the experience that kind of ticks all their boxes and makes them feel that they matter and makes them feel that their work is important, they're going to be your greatest ambassadors.
Absolutely. They really become those advocates, don't they? And of course, we're talking about volunteers that might, as you say, do micro volunteering for 30 minutes, or they could actually be on the board of a not-for-profit as a volunteer. And I know we've talked this, and you talk a lot about this, is that impact of volunteering. And we know grant applications often require it to be counted in hours, but it's that story, which is our pet hate, but it's that storytelling about the impact that the volunteers are making, and not only to the storytelling to the organisation, but storytelling back to the volunteers about the impact they're making.
Where they community to potential volunteers.
That's right.
We need to really be thinking of I guess there's a session I deliver on kind of reimagining the volunteer engagement cycle, and a really key part of that is really thinking about volunteer roles and volunteering before we even get to involving volunteers. And part of that is preparing our organisations. And it's really about making sure that we are having the conversation. How are we going to know that this volunteer role is having the impact we expected it to? One of the traps that we get caught into, and you said before you want to kind of look at what are the things that we're doing that we can really change up to enhance volunteering in our organisations. And one of them is that when we think about volunteers completing tasks that we need to get done, we often never review whether they're having the outcomes we expect them to have. So if we're thinking at the very start, right, I'm thinking about this kind of volunteer role, what is the change I expect to see at the end of it? What is the difference? Is it going to be to staff time? Is it going to be to the experience of a particular group in our community? Is it going to, what's the impact on the volunteer as well? How are we going to measure that? How are we going to know that it's made a difference? Do we need to ask particular groups survey questions? Do we need to count something? What do we need to do? Do we need to do observations, or do we need to plan annual focus groups? And then we need to be tweaking things. We need to be saying, this isn't quite where we hope to be, or we've had this other information, come to the forefront. We need to rethink things. So moving ourselves away from that kind of task-based, just volunteers doing the stuff, really helps us to make sure that we are tapped into that impact of volunteering. We can share it with our stakeholders, share it with our funders, share it with our board. It can support us to get more resources. Data is really important for that, but it can also help us to connect with community about the difference that they can make. A little thing that we can do that I loved. I saw this at the Brain Tumour Charity in the UK. They actually add the impact of the role in every single position description and have them up on their website. So you don't learn about it after the fact. When you're researching what kind of roles you can do, it actually tells you in the role description, this is how doing this particular role is going to make a difference. And it might be about freeing up some time for staff with expertise to deliver more of X, but it also is about the impact on the community that they're serving, obviously patients and their families with brain tumours. So, there's lots of little ways that we can start rethinking how we engage with our community, how we talk to them about volunteering, and how we can help them to see themselves in our organisations.
Exactly. And if we sort of focus on events for a short moment, that often with events we are, not limited, but the event runs from 9 till 4.
Yeah.
And we need people there for those shifts. But it's so much that they bring in, and Fetching Events works on the Bastille Day French Festival. So we have a huge volunteer group, and it's a mix of French expats, it's a mix of Francophone, it's a mix of Francophiles. We get a lot of international students, which is unbelievable. The community and the richness. And not only do the patrons respond, because we always get fantastic feedback about how friendly and welcoming the event is, and that is down to our volunteers. But it's watching the friendships that are made, and the volunteers walking away who came on their own, maybe are out here studying, and suddenly they've got a whole new network. And with that, they're all bringing their own ideas. And I love when someone says, I think we should, we've just noticed this is happening. We think we should change it. Great, And what we have also found is a lot of our volunteers are people who attended the event previously, thought it looked like so much fun and wanted to be involved. And that's, for us, that's when we know we've got success.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think kind of building on what you said, Georgie, about, the impact on people around, through social connections and things like that. Research shows that engaging with people who are different from us helps to develop empathy. And I know for myself, as a values-driven person who, one of my values is social justice. I am a huge idealist. I do imagine what the world would look like, but part of what we know needs to happen for us to create a better world for others is that there's more empathy, that we can see things from other people's perspective. We can appreciate differences between us and other people. And very often in our lives, there are not many spaces where we can connect with people who are different from us.
Yes.
I look around where I live, and God, I love where I live, but it's very homogenous. We're very white. We're very middle class. We're very samesies. We're all very educated. And it is my volunteering where I connect with people from right across the spectrum of our community, where we actually get to build relationships, real relationships with people who are different from us. And that in turn builds greater empathy in our communities, which then creates kind of the environment that we need for greater peace, for better experiences for everyone, for more acceptance, for, for people to feel more confident to advocate for better policies, for equity, So volunteering is actually, as I said, it's a really powerful strategy.
Yes.
If we move away from just thinking about it as doing the stuff.
And that's a good segue into my next question, because, for any organisations who are watching and are looking to recruit, maybe they've got an existing program, they're looking to recruit. What are some of the classic mistakes you see around volunteer recruitment that create those barriers because we put them up and we don't see the opportunities that are actually there?
I think there's kind of two key things really. One is very often we are passive in our recruitment. So, and I know, I've been guilty of it. Teams I've worked with have been guilty of it. We're very busy. We just stick things up online and hope that people find it. We put things on Seek or Go Volunteer or on our website or other kind of platforms where we know people will look, and we just hope that either people who are likely to volunteer will see it, or that people will share it and let other people know. And what we know about volunteering is very often it is about the relationships we build, and that relationship starts when we are giving information to people in our community. So I think passive recruitment is the number one thing. And I think what we can do about that is spend more time building connections in community. So just as you talked about with kind of the equestrian event, what are the communities that are likely to be interested in this? And not just flick them an email, but can I go and deliver an information session at the university? Or can I ask to speak to the U3A one evening? Or can I target particular newsletters for people? can I contact every school in our area and ask to put an article in their newsletter? I think we need to be really focused in, and I know, for events in particular, it's challenging because we're not in like a particular area, right? So if you volunteer in my reconciliation group, it's our local LGA. We're quite contained in terms of location. But I think, becoming creative and building relationships, because it's not just about every year. It then becomes a real challenge because, oh God, I have to get all these volunteers again. But when you have the relationships in place and you can reach out and you say, hey, we're coming up again. Can we come and talk again? Oh, wait, I know some people who might be interested. So I think that's the key one.
And I was just going to, sorry, I was just going to jump in there and just lead on from that. I think that's so important. And I remember seeing a great session at a volunteer conference with, I think it was Ambulance SA, South Australian Ambulance Service, where they have a lot of volunteer first aid responders, for want of a better term, particularly I think in the regional areas. And they had found that the block for people volunteering is they weren't good with blood. And so what they had done was put together this little, brochure that you could pop in your wallet. And they actually gave it to all their volunteers to chat to their friends about volunteering. And because the friends would often say, oh, I would love to do that, but I'm not good with blood, they actually had stats that said, well, that's okay. Only 10% of our cases involve blood or something like that. So that actually equipped their volunteers, made them their
people,
correct, made them their advocates, knew what the response usually back was, were able to respond to that. And I thought that was such a simple tool.
It is,
but they also empowered their volunteers to be their advocates.
Well, I think, that was the second thing I was going to say, Georgie, is we know, that one of the most successful recruitment strategies is by friends and family, and very often we don't equip our current volunteers to actually recruit on our behalf. So speaking to people, having little practice sessions, bringing people together to have conversations about what they can share. At the end of events, kind of giving people a tool, a document, a resource for, hey, we'd love you to share this with your friends and family next year. If you do a survey, a feedback survey, make sure you get that back to people and say, hey, this is what people thought, this is their favourite thing. We'd love you to share this with people. A really great thing I saw in COVID was in a number of op shops, they would stick dots on the floor and say, are you the next volunteer, or is our next volunteer standing on this dot? So actually helping people to see themselves as a part of your organisation when they're not,
I know one thing
to your audience as though they're already a part, or you want them to be a part of your organisation.
And I know with events, we for the volunteers who have signed up, we then say, bring a friend. Like some of these roles you can volunteer in pairs. And because if we have 50 volunteers and we need 200, if each volunteer brings one or two friends, suddenly we've more than doubled. So
group volunteering as well.
Exactly.
I know when I volunteered at the Commonwealth Games, now it was amazing to meet the people that I did. But for those people who maybe have a hesitation because they don't know anyone and there's going to be hundreds of people, are there opportunities for you to guarantee that a team of 6 people can stay together? Because not everyone, well, certainly a lot of people look for the social connection in volunteering. That's a key part of what they do. There is certainly, in my experience, a large number of people who see volunteering as a safe way to address social anxiety. And so they want strategies in place to help them get out of their house and connect with people, but to do so in a less overwhelming way. So if we can create opportunities like group volunteering, then that's fantastic.
Perfect. Okay, so the organisation has gone out to their networks, let's just say. They haven't just put it up on Seek or Go Volunteer. They've gone out to their networks, they've built relationships, they're starting to get interest coming in from volunteers. What's the next mistake you often see in the sort of the sign-up process or the
Yeah.
onboarding process, whether it's for
Yeah.
event volunteers or ongoing volunteering?
Yeah. Usually that we have a single way of entering the volunteer experience. And again, often that is set up because we want a really seamless, streamlined system for us because it is helpful. Whereas not every system works for every person.
Yes.
So for some examples, your organisation requires an interview. Can you look at group interviews? Can you make sure you offer Zoom interviews? Are there opportunities for any particular role where someone might be able to do a trial before they actually sign up? And so there's no need for an extensive interview. It's a brief interview and then spending some time with someone from the organisation. I think it's really important that we consider flexibility at all points of every kind of touch point for volunteers, really, because every person is different.
Yes.
And again, this is a way that we can involve volunteers. So can volunteers be involved in the interview process?
Yes.
There's plenty of HR professionals out there or people who are happy to be trained to come and support you through that process. So I think, making sure that there are ways for anybody to get involved. Are you able to have information sessions where you gather anyone to come in and learn, and then perhaps at the end you have a number of people sitting around the room to have one-on-one conversations and start taking some notes? Make sure that you're asking questions that are relevant, in your application process and your interview, and don't then replicate those. So, an experience that I had was an organisation who was asking about goals in the application process, but they never actually read them in the application, and they never used them to kind of have a conversation about what kind of roles might be beneficial. It was about, no, we need people here. So I think being really mindful of what is your process and how are you using information. Don't waste people's time. So if at all possible, have a really, really simple first touch point application form. If possible, then a conversation. I think connecting with a person is really important. And then asking for any further information that you might need that is relevant to the role, don't be asking a whole bunch of stuff. Do you have a driver's license if the person's not going to be driving?
Absolutely.
Just be really, really clear. And I understand, again, you mentioned it before, Georgie, it's extra work. It is extra work. But in setting up this system, you are better able to engage a much broader.
Yes.
And I think as well, one of the things I'm now talking to organisations about is moving away from, and maybe not so relevant for all events, potentially, I'll have to give it more thought, but moving away from we need to cover X number of shifts with X number of people, and I just need to fill all the gaps. One of the things I'm now talking to organisations about is how can we create a pool of volunteers that are bigger than the number of shifts you've created, so that volunteers can dip in and out. They can support each other. They can create a network and say, oh my God, I can't make it this week. Can someone else fill in? Or some of the great volunteer management systems now allow volunteers to do that themselves, so they can take themselves off a roster and it becomes visible to other volunteers. So, I think creating as much flexibility and ownership of the process for volunteers as possible.
Perfect. And just teasing out that comment you made around, people writing goals down and then we never look at them again. I think that is so important. One thing we're looking at more from an event point of view is, events do have structure. So we need to kind of have people on a ticket desk. We need people, meeting and greeting. We need people working in this area. But what we have historically done is talked about the role, so you'll meet and greet, you'll be the first point of contact. What we haven't always talked about is the soft skills. And so what we're actually looking at doing with some of our events now is saying this is suited for high energy, outgoing people who are happy to chat. Because the last thing we want to do is, an introvert gets scheduled in, and they may have said, yes, I'll do that role, not really understanding. And then you put someone in a role that they're not comfortable in, and that's the last thing we want to do. So actually talk about what kind of person this role would suit. And then people can make that judgment themselves of, actually, no, that's, I don't want to be, having to go up and chat to strangers.
Or even if they'll be with someone else, like
yes,
I can imagine if, yes, I'm introverted and yes, this is a bit nerve-wracking. If I'm there by myself and I have no one else to support me, but I might be okay if I know there's going to be two other people there with me.
Yes.
Because you are going to have people, again, you need to remember you potentially have this entire community of people who want to help you. So there will be people who will be introverts, who will be petrified, but who will want to challenge themselves, So how can you make their experience great as well? So,
and it's giving them the power to make that decision by knowing more about the role, not just, you'll be putting up signs and doing this and this, but understanding more. Well, I'm conscious we've only got a few minutes left. Is there anything, if people could take away one thing from watching this, that they could, whether it's for, a one-off event, maybe they're recruiting for committees, a board, or ongoing, just one thing, one or two things they could take away and a small change?
I think for me, it's the really interrogating the definition and assumptions of volunteering that you carry with you, I think is the biggest thing. So when you think of the word volunteer, or when you think of volunteering in your organisation, what do you think of?
Yes.
And how are those assumptions and definitions restricting you? How can you open your mind a little? What are some of the questions you can ask yourself to really open opportunities for more people to get involved in your organisation?
Fantastic. So that be flexible, challenge ourselves. And that can be really hard because it's challenging the work we've done and making us actually question, what we've built. But as I often say, that sort of progress.
Done that.
Absolutely. And progress is often hindered because of ego. So we've got to leave all of that at the door. Yeah.
But I think it's about remembering that often we've done that because we've seen the expectations of us and we've been overwhelmed. And, it's been about a solution. It's not been about wanting to do things in a way that's not open and accessible for anyone. So I think if you remember that this is about building on your expertise, and it's about creating opportunities, and it's about having real impact in the world.
Yeah, and bring those volunteers in for that co-design.
Yes.
Yes, cool. Excellent. Well, a big thank you, Tracey, for joining us. If people want to find out more, because you run a lot of workshops, you do keynote speaking, you're heading over to New Zealand in a couple of months for their volunteering conference. So if people want to get in touch with you, maybe to bring you in for a workshop or a keynote or some consulting, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
The best way at the moment is on LinkedIn. So I'm Tracey O'Neill, CVA, certified in volunteer administration. So Tracey O'Neill, CVA, on LinkedIn, and hopefully in the coming month or so there'll be a website, traceyo'neillconsulting.com.au.
Perfect. Stay tuned. Well, thank you again. Thank you whether you've been watching in person or you've joined us for the recording of this. Great to have you here. This is the latest one in our Elevating Events in 2025 series. We will have another one. Our next webinar coming up will be on customer experience, which I'll be taking that one. But a big thank you, Tracey. It's for those watching live, wishing you a wonderful Friday, and we just look forward to volunteering becoming stronger and stronger.
Beautiful. Thanks, Georgie.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.